Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, September 18th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the state of New Hampshire. Don Bolduc and Maggie Hassan, who are facing off against each other in the U.S. Senate race this November midterm election. Now, the topic of this video is going to be generally about the Republican Party in the state of New Hampshire. My emphasis and focus is going to be on the Senate race, but we are going to explore the coinciding House races in the 1st and 2nd congressional districts. Now, Maggie Hassan in the state of New Hampshire is an electoral incumbent, and the Democrats also currently hold both House seats in the state of New Hampshire. Now, as of right now, there is one incumbent in New Hampshire's 1st congressional district. That is Representative Chris Pappas. He is in a toss-up race, a Trump district, and in an overall very, very competitive race. The neighboring 2nd district is more Democratic. Biden won here by about 15 points, and currently there is also an incumbent as well. So the Democrats pretty much have solidified the top 3 races, at least when it comes down to the House 1st and 2nd district, in addition to the Senate seat where they all have an incumbent. The only race where there really isn't an incumbent for the Democratic Party is the governor's race that is occurring alongside this election as well, with a Republican, Chris Sununu, who is exceptionally popular, but by no means a representation of the National Republican Party. Now, the main focus also, in addition to the Senate race, is just generally going to be discussing how the Republican Party fell so short when it came down to the state of New Hampshire. Now, the nominees and the Republicans that were being propped up against these Democrats were not set in stone up until recently. The Tuesday primary pretty much decided who was going to be on the ballot this November, and none of it is really good news for the GOP. On one front, I will say that there is good news for the Trump wing of the Republican Party to the extent that their candidates were nominated and chosen by the voters in New Hampshire. But beyond that, there isn't much good news when it comes down to the general election, especially if we find that in said general election, all of these Trump Republicans end up losing, which would be quite, truly speaking, a bad look for President Trump and his electability when it comes down to other races. So, as we look through the first primary, the Senate race that we were talking about in the beginning of this video, it was a very close and competitive race. It was between Don Bolduc, a retired U.S. Army veteran, and Chuck Morse, the Senate Majority Leader for the Republican Party. Yes, Republicans hold the majority in the state Senate in New Hampshire. It was a close and competitive race because, quite frankly, these two candidates were the remaining picks when it came down to who potentially could have ran and who was actually running. All of these Republicans that are on this ballot and were on the ballot for the GOP primary for Senate all had announced previously that they were running, and there wasn't really much expectation that they would announce, largely because they were not viewed as the most electable and best candidates for the Republican Party. That fell on Governor Chris Sununu, who ultimately won his primary, but decided not to run for the Senate race, which he more than likely would have been a shoo-in for. And we'll talk about that once we get to the Senate. But on top of the Senate primary results, we also have 1st and 2nd GOP primary district results as well. The Democrats, of course, as being the incumbents, didn't really face opposition to the extent that an open and contested primary might against, not necessarily an incumbent, because obviously there's no incumbent in an open race, but in a competitive and swing district seat when it comes down to the primary. In New Hampshire's 1st district, Caroline Leavitt, the Republican who is actually 25 years old, who was very closely aligned with President Trump, defeated Matt Mowers, who actually served in the Trump administration. Now, on one front, you might say there is nothing here saying that, this is a victory for President Trump because his Trump administration alumni, as described by this Politico article, did not win his election. However, I will say, Caroline Leavitt has absolutely aligned herself with the National Republican Party to the extent that it is associated with President Trump. She wasn't directly endorsed by President Trump. He did not make an endorsement in this race, but both of these top 2 contenders were absolutely the quote-unquote Trump candidates. When it came down to the 2nd congressional district, you will find here that President Trump did not endorse either in the 2nd district race, but Robert Burns is the more Trump candidate who has positioned himself as such, enough so that the Democratic Party has allocated money and resources, or at least Democratic-aligned super PACs, maybe not necessarily the Democratic Party themselves, but Democratic-aligned super PACs boosted up Robert Burns in this primary, largely because they knew that his close association with President Trump would win him over Republican voters, but lose him the general election. And that's what the Democratic Party is counting on. But the main takeaway I want you to take from the New Hampshire 1st and 2nd district and also the Senate primary is that Donald Trump's influence at least has a negative impact on the outcome of these, potential outcome at least, of these general election candidates. You see, there were better nominees that could have been positioned and ran in any of these races, especially on the Senate level, but you simply aren't seeing that happen. Looking at the New Hampshire Senate poll that was just released from Emerson College that shows that Maggie Hassan is leading by 11 points statewide is super significant. It's the first poll that we have seen since April of 2022 between Maggie Hassan and Don Bolduc, the Republican nominee. And it looks like the change in sentiment is very apparent. The polls prior to the Dobbs decision being released from the University of New Hampshire said Maggie Hassan would win by 1. St. Anselm College said Maggie Hassan would win by 5. When you look at numbers prior to, St. Anselm again, January 2022, Maggie Hassan wins by 7. Trafalgar says Maggie Hassan wins by 6. University of New Hampshire says she wins by 5 and 10 points. But nothing is larger than this lead from Emerson College that shows Maggie Hassan with an 11-point lead. Now, you might be saying, okay, the Democratic Party, as of right now, is not in a position where New Hampshire should be this 11-point victory. I don't personally think it will be an 11-point victory, but I do think that the numbers that we are seeing are a display of Maggie Hassan's strength at this point in time. Because that 40% number, I don't buy. I don't think by the end of this we find that the Republican nominee for Senate in New Hampshire, a swing and competitive state that went to President Biden by 7% in 2020, is going to the Democrats by 11 points, or even the Republican only getting 40% of the vote, meaning that the combined vote share against the Republican is 60%. I don't buy that, and I don't buy that because it's unrealistic for the state of New Hampshire, and we do have to recognize that. But what I do buy is Maggie Hassan being at 51%. And I buy this average that she's up by about 5 to 6 points statewide. I am much more confident in Maggie Hassan, largely because Don Bolduc simply is not the most electable Republican that it could have been put up on the ballot either. Don Bolduc also is someone who has been closely associated with President Trump, regardless if that is his intention or not, which quite frankly, it definitely seemed as if it was his intention for a long time in the campaign period. What we found here is that any association with the former president in a state that did not vote for him is not going to be necessarily positive. When you look back at the 2020 presidential race, you see that Biden was defeating Trump in the polls by about 8 to 10 points statewide. What you found with the actual results were Biden won by 7.2%. Hillary Clinton, for reference, won by 0.3. Even Obama in 2012 won by just 5.6. So Biden turned around the state of New Hampshire. I think what he did was able to solidify, especially in a state that really, the shifts across the nation, especially amongst white suburbanites, that was something that really benefited Biden. And in most states where it would benefit him the most, New Hampshire is one of them. You also saw a similar shift in Maine, in Vermont, states with a similar ideological and racial composition, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, all states where Biden did better than Hillary Clinton. And a lot of that is attributed to that overall national shift that we saw exhibited. But in the state of New Hampshire specifically, Donald Trump clearly was not popular. Because even in 2016, when Trump flipped Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Ohio, Florida, right? These are all states that Obama won in 2012. Obama won 2008, Indiana, North Carolina as well. Those states flipped back to the Republicans in 2012. But then, 2016, Trump still wins them. The point is that Trump was able to flip so many states, right? But New Hampshire did not flip. There was clearly a pushback on President Trump in New Hampshire, and it was clearly displayed again in 2020. So for any Republican nominee, Don Bolduc or anyone else, to be so closely associated with President Trump, it simply doesn't help. It also is something to be said that New Hampshire is an overwhelmingly pro-choice state. This is a state that if there was to be a referendum, I would bet money that 60% of the residents plus would support a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to abortion across the state. Just because it's a swing state does not mean that it is equally pro-life and equally pro-choice, which means that when it comes down to making these some of the most important issues for the midterm elections, Democrats will come out ahead. And they currently are in the state of New Hampshire as well. The Republican Party also sometimes relies, and so do Democrats, but both parties on occasion rely on other candidates dragging the lackluster candidates across the finish line. For instance, in the state of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu is largely viewed as this one Republican who could drag other Republicans across the finish line because he's so exceptionally popular. Well, that didn't exactly work out in the governor, Senate, and presidential race in 2020 when it came down to New Hampshire. As I already showed you, President Biden won New Hampshire by 7, but the Senate race actually went to the Democrats by 16 points. But then you head over and take a look at the governor's race, and Chris Sununu won by 32. So the Republican nominee for governor, Chris Sununu, won by 32 points. But then you find that in the Senate race, Jeanne Shaheen won by 16. And then on the presidential race, Biden won by 7. So no, it is not true that there is this significant, bump by a prominent Republican on the ballot helping these other down ballot Republicans. But what I will say is that there sometimes is a residual effect or a significant amount of people who vote for one party because they voted for one party on the top of the ticket. Most of our ballots are cast as one ballot, but New Hampshire clearly showed that that doesn't matter to the extent that you might think. Because based off the other results, one would argue that Chris Sununu should not have even been able to win, much less win by 32. Or that if Chris Sununu, as a Republican governor, is winning by 32, then Biden should not have been able to win this swing state, and the Democrats should have lost it on the Senate level. But obviously, that did not happen. For 2022, I do not think Chris Sununu being on the ballot is going to have any impact on the Senate race or these House races. It might have been better. Let's say, for instance, if we're talking about congressional races as a whole, if the Republicans had a prominent and strong GOP nominee, maybe that could have helped. Because people vote differently on the governor level as well than they do on congressional elections, but if they're voting for one congressional Republican, there is a chance that they consider voting for another. But the problem is, the nominees that were chosen by the New Hampshire GOP last evening, or not last evening, but last Tuesday, are not ones that exactly provide them any type of electoral benefit. On one hand, you find the 2nd District shows that the Democrat here is winning by 18 points district-wide. This is a Biden district where he got 58% of the vote to Trump's 42. That's a 16-point difference, now going to an 18-point difference between the Democrat and the Republican. When looking at the 1st congressional district, Chris Pappas is largely viewed as someone who is more than likely going to lose re-election, at least from the Republican side of the narrative. But right now, he leads by 5 points district-wide. That's good for the incumbent Democrat. That's good for Democrats across the state. Because if they're winning the 1st district by 5 points, this Senate race is a done deal and was never even under consideration. Because back in 2020, Biden won the state by 7 points, but lost the 1st district to Donald Trump. And yet somehow the district itself ended up going towards the Democrats. Now, the 2nd district certainly loves their Democrat significantly more than the 1st district does. But both of these races, at least some point in time, should have been competitive by overall PVI. The 1st district, especially given our current state of the national environment, but it isn't, at least to the extent that we thought, and certainly not in a way that makes it so the Democratic Party is doomed by Election Day. I also want to say that the forecasters seem to be getting the numbers at least somewhat correct as well. It shows that Maggie Hassan has an 85% chance of victory, and I think that's something that we can also really expect when it comes down to the Senate race in the state of New Hampshire. Also looking at the 2 congressional elections in New Hampshire as well, you can see that on one hand, the 1st district, the one where you saw Chris Pappas lead by about 5 points district-wide, he's leading by about 5 points in the district. And then the 2nd district, you find that the Democrat here is expected to win with about 95% of the vote. So I think truly in New Hampshire's 2nd, New Hampshire's 1st, not 95% of the vote, 95% chance that she wins the election, 56% vote share by expectation. So for both of these districts, you have the Democrats up. In the Senate race, you also have the Democrat up in the state of New Hampshire as well. And quite frankly, it is embarrassing to the extent that New Hampshire was a state that Republicans were so closely watching and expecting potentially at one point in time to win. Earlier on in the forecast, Republicans had about a 1 in 3 chance at winning in the state of New Hampshire. Today, that has dwindled to nearly just 1 in 10. And looking at the predicted numbers as well, when you go on the 90-day average, you will see that it was significantly closer prior to. The Democrats and Republicans were practically neck and neck, and at different points, the Republicans were ahead in the state of New Hampshire. Even my own estimations, following the Glenn Youngkin victory in the state of Virginia, had the state of New Hampshire as a likely red state. But now it has made the trek. It has made a significant movement in favor of the Democratic Party. And today I have it as a likely Democratic state. So I wrap this up all by saying, just looking at the numbers that we have found from the state of New Hampshire, if we were to look at this from the Republican perspective, it simply is not good. They were waiting for this final primary to really solidify behind these GOP nominees, and there's still time for a lot of the undecided vote to go towards the GOP. But at this point in time, the Democrats have very clearly locked down at least one congressional district, one Senate race that should have been significantly more competitive. It was the closest race back in 2016. Maggie Hassan won by about 1,000 votes out of over 500,000 cast. And yet somehow it's expected to be one of the least competitive swing states this midterm cycle, despite the overall national environment not being necessarily so conducive to the Democratic Party. So we'll see what happens in the state of New Hampshire. Right now, the Democrats have a 71% chance at winning control of the Senate. The Democrats also in New Hampshire have an 85% chance in the Senate race as well. The Republican Party certainly has made a lot of missteps. A lot of it has to do with the Trump association and the Trump-style candidacy that benefits a Republican in the primary, but not so much in the general election, and that's something that needs to be unpacked following this election, should the Republicans lose as they are expected to as of right now. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.